Britain wants to cut emissions faster than any other industrialised country. Hot air? We may find out at this weekend's Global Climate Summit. The UK is hosting the online meeting exactly 5 years after the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. How far has the world come in that time? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. If you are dreaming of a white Christmas, then dream on, because it's been suggested that snow at any time of the year, in this country at least, could become a thing of the past, unless things change very quickly indeed. 5 years on from the deal in France, and this week's virtual summit is an opportunity for governments to show their commitment to reaching the Paris goals by the year 2050. The UK government's promised to cut greenhouse gas emissions by more than 2/3 of what they were in 1990 by the year 2030. It wants other countries to do the same. But the gap between the promises and the policies to achieve them remains significant. According to a new report by the Climate Action Tracker Group, the goals of the Paris Agreement are, as it puts it, within reach. Promises from China and the incoming US president could mean temperature rises are limited to 2.1 degrees by the end of this century. But those plans need to be put into action, and fast. So half a decade since Paris, what real progress has been made? Well, I'm very pleased to be able to say we can welcome Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics to the programme. We also say hello to Claire James, Campaigns Coordinator at the Campaign Against Climate Change, and also with us Alison Doig, International Lead at Energy and Climate Intelligence UK. You are all very much invested in this. You've all been looking at it for the last 5 years and probably a great deal longer. But going back to Paris, I'm going to ask you each in turn to name what you think the biggest leap forward has been. And please, if somebody's already said it, don't say it again. You've got to come up with another one. So you first, Bob, what do you think's changed the most in the last 5 years?
Well, I think since Paris 5 years ago, the major changes have been the commitments that have been made, mostly within the last year, by countries to set targets for reaching net zero emissions. Essentially, we don't stop climate change until the whole world reaches essentially zero emissions of greenhouse gases. And we now have most of the major countries have made commitments. The UK made a commitment to be reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We now have China, the largest emitter, has pledged to reach zero emissions by 2060. And the United States under Joe Biden, it looks like they will have a target of getting to net zero by 2050.
Okay, so well, I will ask you in a little while. I'll ask you in a little while if you believe what China is saying, among other things. Claire, let me come to you. You can't repeat what Bob's just said. So what do you think the most important thing we've seen in the last 5 years has been?
Well, from a personal perspective, I think it's the change in the public discourse around climate change, and really, I mean, not entirely, we still see it in the US, but the falling away of the idea that, you know, climate skepticism is something valid. And then alongside that, the amazing mobilizations that we've seen with school children coming out onto the streets in hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, well, there certainly has been a change in public perception on this. You don't seem to get too many climate deniers. Okay, so that's your major change in the last 5 years. Alison, I'm sorry to have to come to you last because you may have wanted to repeat both of those. Go on, give us your thoughts.
No, I mean, to me, the biggest change and the most positive change has been the price of renewable energy has just plummeted over this time. Even 5 years ago, renewables were seen as slight outliers, a bit expensive, a bit cumbersome, maybe only part of the grid capacity, whereas actually now renewables are becoming dominant. They're cost effective, that's solar and wind. Are just of a price that are comparative. And I think particularly if you look in the US, for example, where they've moved from coal to gas, they're now shifting to renewables. And that's not because of any legislation during the Trump years. They've shifted in that direction because the price has come down. It is more cost effective. So it makes sense.
Okay, let's go back to you, Bob, and you can say anything at any time. Anybody do jump in. Do you believe the UK when it says it's going to be able to cut its emissions by the amount it claims it can do?
Well, the UK has already cut its emissions by 45% compared to the 1990 baseline, which we use, and it has now set a target of reaching a cut of 68% by 2030 and then reaching net zero by 2050. Now, most of the cuts we've made so far have been by phasing coal out of our power generation. We're now down to less than 10% of our electricity being generated through burning coal. But we now have some very tough measures we need to now take in decarbonising the whole economy. For instance, stopping the use of petrol and diesel cars, getting rid of gas central heating in homes, changing our industrial processes that involve emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's going to be tough, but I think we can do it. It does require strong investment, but fortunately, those investments will bring lots of other benefits. It will generate growth and jobs, which is particularly important as we come out of the pandemic, but it will also help improve the quality of people's lives. You know, having electric vehicles in cities and better public transport will reduce air pollution and congestion.
As long as you can hear them coming. Claire, I know you don't think the UK has been fast enough, but a bit dilatory.
It's unfortunate that the situation that we're in means that while the government is, has upped its game on climate, it's still such a long way from where we need to be. And I totally agree with Bob that, these things are technically feasible, but you need the political will to do it. Now, what you need is for this not to be a question for the, Business and Energy Department. It needs to be something that is fundamental to the business of government. It doesn't need to push out other objectives. As Bob said, these things go together, creating jobs, decent housing, cleaner air, but it needs to underline them all. So,
but isn't that already happening to some extent when you have a younger generation that's saying to those people in charge, get on with it, when you can see that renewable energy, as has been mentioned, has come down in price? Isn't that momentum already there?
Well, when you face a challenge of this scale, and it is, you can't underestimate it. If we don't cut emissions rapidly globally, we'll be looking at breaching the target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in like a decade. So, it's not just about setting goals for 2050. The challenge is huge. And you can see sometimes that it just doesn't seem like the government's really taken it on board. So on the one hand, you have let's invest in offshore wind. On the other hand, you've got a £27 billion budget for building roads. So this is the sort of non-joined up thinking that is going to do us down. And yes, these individual
but if you don't build roads, you're going to have massive traffic congestion because you can't get rid of cars overnight, and then all going to be electric, and that would be far worse for the climate, wouldn't it?
Can I come in here? I think
please.
What we're all saying is that we need to get out of the starting blocks right now. We've set these targets. Maybe they should be higher, and we can debate about that. But actually, what's important is we get out of the starting blocks right now, and that means changing, and that means the government leading the change. But we all need to change how we travel. And if it's moving to electric vehicles, roads aren't a bad idea, but that's not the only solution. There's public transport, there are other means, there's working from home, as we've discovered in this COVID year. We're going to be investing as we come out of the COVID economic slump, we're investing hugely. It's not all new money. A lot of it is what's going to be invested already. And it's got to be invested in a shrewd way that doesn't take us to a new climate crisis, but it takes us out of that, or at least it plays the UK's role. There's investment going to happen. So as we've heard, it's about how we travel. It's not just cars and roads. It's about how we travel and how we travel cleanly. It's about our buildings, building new buildings that are super efficient, putting in heat pumps, not new old gas boilers. So it's really about that kicking off day one. So a lot of Boris Johnson's 10-point plan for a green revolution, a number of those technologies are future technologies. Hydrogen and many of these are up and coming, but actually there's a lot we can do right now while we innovate for the future. So I think it's really, I think that's a critical message. Yeah, it's shoot the starting gun for the race with the target, but we need to get moving. I think the other element of this target setting is it coming ahead of a big climate ambition summit that the UK is co-hosting at the weekend. And I think there's political signals here internationally. The UK is the COP26 climate champion for next year, the president for next year. And that, I think the political signal of the UK upping its game just ahead of the European Union's decision. It'll look to up its target this week also. And then more countries will be coming forward with their own commitments at the weekend. So I think there's
we would have seen the COP26 meeting in Glasgow this month had it not been for the pandemic, and we'll talk about how much the pandemic has maybe slowed down environmental efforts. But Bob, I want to come back to you first of all, because there we had Alison talking about the UK, we had mention of the European Union, and you brought up China at the beginning, and I said I would ask you later on whether you believed them when they said they would reduce their emissions as much as they claim they want to. What do you think?
Well, they have a big challenge. They've got a huge population which they're trying to bring out of poverty and raising living standards. So they face a bigger challenge than the rich countries in tackling their emissions. And at the moment, their emissions have been going up. They went up very steeply between 2000 and 2010, but there are signs that it's beginning to level off. The commitment that Xi Jinping made in September at the UN to reach so-called carbon neutrality or net zero emissions by 2060 is the most significant development in climate policy I think we've seen for many years. Now, it is going to be very difficult, and in particular, it's going to have to find a way of reconciling that goal with the 14th five-year plan, which China is currently agreeing at the moment. And at present, their goal is just to reach peak emissions by 2030, which would mean they could potentially go up for the next 10 years still, and then would have to come down to zero.
You don't perhaps think that it is China virtue signaling, because everybody seemed to be sort of anti-China, partly because of what happened in Wuhan. You think it's a realistic goal and it's one that they believe in?
No, China's committed to this. It is the largest investor in renewable energy. It has huge plans to build a whole new generation of nuclear power plants. It understands this because it has a population far more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than many of the rich countries. Has a lot of people who are vulnerable to the impacts of drought, to sea level rise along their coast. So they understand this. They also recognize that this is a big economic opportunity, lots of opportunity for them to develop market growth, both as a domestic supplier, but also in terms of developing markets. So I don't think there's any doubt that they're committed. The question is whether they can practically get from where they are now down to zero by 2060, and that's going to be very difficult.
So Claire, going on to the pandemic, what do you think the effect of it has been? Because to some extent it's in a way been quite good, because we've seen fewer people traveling, lower emissions, but it also may have taken other people's eyes off the targets for reducing global greenhouse gases.
Well, the actual impact on emissions, I mean, although it was obviously a global effect, it seems to have been more of a blip, not the sort of permanent reduction that we need. And one thing that's been surprising in a good way, certainly here in the UK, is that usually you'd think people would be very much so focused on the immediate problems that they're facing that would make climate change go down as a priority. But actually, as many opinion polls have shown, that people are more aware of climate change, and there's a huge public demand for all this money. People see the money that's being needed to be put in to get the economy going, and there's a huge demand for this money to be used to tackle the two problems at once, to use it to create the climate jobs that are needed by the increasing numbers of unemployed, at the same time create the infrastructure that we need. And they see that this win-win situation there. Unfortunately, a lot of the recovery money has gone into propping up fossil fuels, much more than has gone into renewable energy. So I feel that has been so far a bit of a missed opportunity by world governments.
I'm going to ask you each to consider what you would think the main goals should be of this weekend summit, what's been called the sprint to Glasgow this time next year when the main meeting does take place. So have a think about that. As I ask you, Alison, about something you said to one of our producers, you said there has been an increased role of nature regulating global climate levels. And I was fascinated to know what you meant by that.
Well, I think when we talk climate, we use and climate action, mostly it's about fossil fuels versus renewables. But actually, the dialogue has brought in what they call nature-based solutions or natural solutions, really appreciating the fact that nature is our carbon regulator. It has been forever, and we need to start really appreciating how much it can regulate and it can remove the carbon from the atmosphere. Not that we shouldn't. We should definitely cut all of the emissions. You absolutely can, but nature's there as a huge part of the solution to take the carbon out and take it back into that natural space, into away from the atmosphere as it should do. And of course, as we look at natural solutions, we're talking about peat bogs, we're talking about planting trees, the oceans. It's how do we care for those in a way that we look after the planet and we actually see it as part of that solution to the overall climate sum. So we should do everything we can to cut emissions, but look after nature, look after forestries and peats and oceans so that they can continue to absorb the carbon and really get us well below that critical target of 1.5 degrees of warming, to keep below that.
Fascinating. And I think the public consciousness is aware of that, if there is such a thing as that. I think people are becoming more and more understanding about the role of the natural world in this. Bob, I'm going to start off with you. What do you want to see achieved at the mini summit this weekend, this sprint to Glasgow next year?
Well, the best thing that can happen at this summit is for countries to come forward with pledges for more ambitious action than they've already committed to. The Glasgow summit that will take place next year is the 5th of the UN summits to take place since Paris, and countries are required to come forward with revised pledges that are more ambitious than in the past. That means primarily in terms of not just their net zero target, but also their nearer term targets, their target for emissions reductions by 2030. That will give a real sense of momentum and a sense that people are not just leaving this to setting far targets, but are actually taking action now. Things that will be done over the next 10 years.
We've seen this so many times. Countries make promises. When it comes to disaster relief, they say we're going to give hundreds of millions of pounds, and it's a promise that's never kept. And in the case of climate change, I think you believe that very few countries have been meeting the promises that they've made.
No, that's not true. Countries like the UK, the European Union, plenty of other countries are cutting their emissions. Now, they need to cut them faster than they are, but to claim that we're not doing anything is completely wrong. We are making progress. It's not nearly enough, and we need countries to commit to even faster cuts. Fortunately, countries are beginning to see that this is not a trade-off with growth and development. The UK's economy has been growing whilst it's been cutting its emissions, and that shows that you do not have to sacrifice economic growth in order to reduce emissions. And that's an absolutely critical insight that we now have.
Okay, well, I'm sorry if I put the wrong words into your mouth. I'll check up on my notes and make sure I don't do that again. Claire, what do you reckon? What needs to come out of this meeting?
Well, what I'd like to see come out of it would be the commitments to be absolutely in line with what the science needs, and focusing, as Bob said, on these short-term actions, not just long-term targets. Maybe more realistically, I'd hope that the fact that Trump is now imminently out of office may put some more pressure on countries which are really holding out against climate action, the sort of the strongholds of climate skepticism. Because what we need to tackle climate change is a global problem, and you need that sense of global trust. and the willingness of countries to put pressure on others when they don't act, and for this to be seen as a real underpinning of international negotiations. So I hope very much that the commitments we made this weekend then that can start taking action, because the extra year till 2021, this is actually a significant chunk of the time we've got left to get our emissions down. So
do you know
we
what?
need to see
We've
strong
done,
commitment and action now.
We've done so many programs on climate change, and I'm very proud to say that we will keep doing so. But the one thing I'm struck with the three of you is that perhaps for the first time, I feel some optimism. Your turn.
Yeah, and I think that's what this summit needs to do. It needs to give an optimism that this low carbon, zero carbon world is possible. You have countries who may not be ready to come forward. So India, Indonesia, they're heavily dependent on coal right now. They need confidence that the market directions are changing, that the technologies, the viability and affordability of these technologies is going to improve. So if they are going to take that change and make a commitment, maybe into next year, that actually they've got the backing from the wealthy nations, from the US, from Europe, from UK, to take them in that direction. So I think the optimism is needed, but it really needs to be followed through with action, but action that gives that confidence to countries that maybe struggle to do it right now because their economies are still emerging and developing.
Claire, are you optimistic? Do you see good signs?
Well, not maybe less optimistic. I think that the message really needs to be balanced, because on the one hand, what's the optimistic is we have a lot of the technologies now to take action. We don't need to wait for some of these sort of in development things. We can really start taking action now. On the other hand, what we see happening in the natural world, the ice caps melting, horrendous wildfires, hurricanes, whatever, it's terrifying. And so I think there's that positive, optimistic message. On the other hand, you have to be aware of what's going on and also hear the voice of the young people of Greta Thunberg stand there saying, you've had decades to sort this out, get your act together, no excuses.
Well, I detected a little bit of optimism. Alison, your thoughts, then back to you, Bob.
But just to follow what Claire was saying, you've got a number of the countries that will be making announcements at the summit this weekend are from what are called the most vulnerable countries. These are Pacific islands that are low-lying. It's Bangladesh, which is exceptionally low-lying and very vulnerable to sea rise. And they see these targets as survival targets. They literally won't survive. If you're in a big city like Lagos, which is right on the ocean edge, if you're in one of the informal communities there, the slum communities there, your life, your livelihoods, your family is at risk directly if we don't deal with this. So the urgency has to be there. But we have to be optimistic. We have to push forward optimistically. We need to use this momentum to really take us and make sure that their survival, this 1.5 degrees that they see is needed to stay below for their survival, is actually reachable.
And Bob, the way this is going to be achieved, more carrots, more incentives.
Yeah, we need to move faster, a lot faster than we're moving at the moment, and we need a lot more political will, but we need wise policy making that creates the right incentives, because most of these emissions reductions are going to be done through the work of the private sector, and companies will only invest and take action if they have confidence that policymakers have consistent and strong and credible policies in place, and that's what we really need.
Alison, can it be done?
The climate is going to change. We're going to get dangerously close to some of the limits that we're looking at. But with the political will, with the investment, and I think with every person on the planet actually doing their part, because we all need to change how we live. Yes, it can, and we need to start really soon.
Quick one to end with. The Met Office, I mentioned at the beginning, saying that there may be no more snow in the UK in future, except perhaps in your homeland, Alison, Scotland. What do you think of that? True, or perhaps a bit of an exaggeration?
I think that's true. I think that there's very rare sighting of snow where I live now in Surrey. The hilltops, I think, in Scotland will continue, but I think it is. I mean, I've seen spring flowers out in my garden right now, and I've seen them for probably the last 3 years. So there are changes happening that we can see outside our doors right now.
And if you had one message, Bob, you last of all, if you had one message for those people gathering on this online summit, what would it be?
Well, time to act and time to speed up action. We're running out of time. Now's the time to be investing and taking action.
Appreciate your time, each and every one of you. Great to have you on the programme. From me, David Foster, that is all we have time for on this edition of Roundtable. If you can, join us on another occasion when we'll have more lively debate and discussion. Until then, goodbye.